Daniel Matthews navigated the bustling corridors of Lincoln High, his worn athletic shoes barely audible against the gleaming floors reflecting the harsh overhead lights. The seemingly endless hallways, adorned with faded institutional blue lockers, buzzed with student chatter. Standing at just 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing approximately 120 pounds when soaking wet, his small stature had been a daily point of emphasis since he began at Lincoln 3 months prior. His light brown hair loosely covered his forehead, partly obscuring his pale green eyes that seemed to absorb everything while revealing nothing. He walked to the center of the lot and waited, hands at his sides, breathing steady and controlled. The crowd formed a loose circle around him, their phones ready to record what they assumed would be a brief and violent encounter. The energy was electric, charged with the anticipation of teenagers about to witness real conflict. Brett showed up 5 minutes later with Ryan and Tyler flanking him like bodyguards. He had changed into athletic shorts and a tank top, clearly expecting a physical confrontation. The size difference was immediately apparent. Brett had at least 6 inches and 40 pounds on Daniel. "Last chance to apologize, freak," Brett called out as he approached, his voice carrying the bravado that had served him well for years. "Say you're sorry for wasting everyone's time, and maybe I'll go easy on you." Daniel looked around at the crowd, many with phones ready to record. He thought about months of harassment, humiliation, the way they had all stood by and watched. The final bell rang at 3:15, and by 3:30, nearly 60 students had gathered in the empty lot behind the gymnasium. The space was hidden from the main buildings by a line of trees, making it perfect for unofficial conflicts. The ground was packed dirt mixed with gravel, hard enough to provide stable footing, but unforgiving to anyone who fell. Word had spread through social media and text messages, creating a buzz of anticipation that drew students from all grades. Some had come to support Brett, others were curious about the quiet kid who had finally snapped. Many simply wanted to witness what they assumed would be a one-sided beatdown. Daniel arrived exactly on time, still wearing jeans and a flannel shirt, still looking like the same quiet kid who had endured abuse for months, but his bearing was different now, more confident, more purposeful. But something about Daniel's sudden transformation had unsettled him. He found himself studying the smaller boy during their shared classes, looking for signs of hidden strength or weakness. "He's probably never been in a real fight," Ryan assured him during lunch, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "You're going to destroy him." "I know that," Brett snapped, but his voice carried uncertainty. The confidence that had defined him for years was beginning to crack under the pressure of facing an unknown opponent. Tyler remained largely silent, his discomfort with the situation evident. He had never been comfortable with the group's bullying tactics, but had gone along to avoid becoming a target himself. Now, faced with the possibility of real violence, he was questioning his loyalty to Brett. But something was different now, something that made students step aside when he walked the hallways. He moved with the same controlled grace, but now it seemed less like timidity and more like coiled potential. His teachers noticed the change as well. Mr. Peterson, his math teacher, observed that Daniel seemed more present in class, more engaged. His answers were sharper, his participation more confident. It was as if the decision to fight had liberated something in him. Brett struggled with the situation throughout the day. He could not back down without losing face. The next day, the atmosphere at Lincoln High was electric with anticipation. Students who had never spoken to Daniel were asking questions, their curiosity overcoming their usual indifference. Was he really going to fight Brett? Did he know Brett outweighed him by 60 pounds? Had he ever fought before? The questions came during passing periods, between classes, even during lunch. "Are you serious about this?" a girl named Jennifer asked during chemistry class. "Brett's huge compared to you." Daniel answered none of them, maintaining his quiet demeanor. The conversation continued for another hour, with Michael providing guidance on both technique and philosophy. They discussed the difference between aggression and controlled violence, the importance of proportional response, and the responsibility that came with superior skill. "Remember," Michael said as they prepared to leave the basement, "the goal isn't to hurt him, it's to end the conflict. There's a difference." Daniel nodded, understanding the distinction. Violence as a solution versus violence as a tool. The difference between a bully and a protector. The line between losing control and maintaining discipline even in the midst of combat. What happens to him depends on how far he wants to take it. Michael smiled slightly, pride evident in his expression. Your control has always been your greatest strength, son. But remember, once you show them what you can do, there's no going back. Good, Daniel said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. I'm tired of being invisible. Because ignoring them wasn't working anymore, Daniel replied, his voice carrying a weight that made him sound older than his 16 years. They tripped me in front of half the school today. Everyone laughed. Michael understood. Humiliation was sometimes more damaging than physical pain, especially for a teenager trying to find his place in the world. And tomorrow, you're going to hurt this boy. Daniel considered the question carefully, his mind working through the implications. I'm going to defend myself. The boy's movements were more intense than usual, his techniques sharper, his focus laser-like. Michael had trained fighters for 20 years, and he recognized the signs of someone preparing for war. Something happened today, Michael observed, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of teaching martial arts. Daniel paused in his stretching, his breathing slightly elevated from the workout. I challenged someone to a fight. Michael nodded slowly, unsurprised. He had been watching his son endure months of harassment, waiting for the moment when peaceful resolution would no longer be possible. And why? The teachers noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. Students were whispering more than usual, their conversations stopping abruptly when adults approached. There was an electric tension in the air that suggested something significant was about to happen. Mrs. Rodriguez noticed Daniel's torn notebook during English class and asked if he was okay. For a moment, she thought he might confide in her, but then his expression closed off, and he simply nodded. She made a mental note to keep an eye on him, sensing that something important was brewing beneath the surface. That evening, Daniel spent time in his family's basement gym, a small space with mats, a heavy bag, and basic training equipment. The room was a sanctuary, a place where he could practice without judgment or interruption. The walls were covered with mirrors, allowing him to observe his form from every angle. His father, Michael Matthews, watched from the doorway as Daniel worked through his usual routine. Word spread through Lincoln High like wildfire, the story growing and changing with each telling. By the end of the first period, everyone knew that the quiet new kid had challenged Brett Henderson. By lunch, the details had been embellished beyond recognition, but the core truth remained. Daniel Matthews was no longer hiding. Some students were excited to see Brett finally tested. He had ruled the school through intimidation for too long, and there was a hunger to see him face real opposition. Others were planning to record what they assumed would be an inevitable beatdown, their phones ready to capture the moment when the natural order was restored. Brett's face was red, trapped by his reputation, and the crowd of students watching expectantly. He could not back down without losing everything he had built. But something about Daniel's sudden transformation was deeply unsettling. You're crazy. If you think I'm wasting time fighting some scrawny transfer student, Brett said, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. Then stop bothering me, Daniel said simply. Your choice. He turned and walked away, leaving Brett standing with his mouth open and his friends looking uncertain. The crowd parted before him like water, students instinctively stepping aside as he passed. The transformation was complete and unmistakable. The victim had become something else entirely. Is the little mouse trying to sound tough? Daniel's gaze shifted to Ryan, and the wrestler felt an unexpected chill run down his spine. There was something in those eyes that promised violence, something that suggested Daniel knew exactly what he was capable of. If you want to make it 2-on-1, that's your choice, Daniel said calmly. But know that I won't hold back anymore. The word anymore hung in the air like a threat, implying capabilities none of them had suspected. It suggested that Daniel had been restraining himself, that his months of passive acceptance had been a choice rather than weakness. Brett blinked, certain he had misheard. The quiet kid who had endured abuse for months was issuing a challenge. It was impossible, absurd, but the words hung in the air with unmistakable clarity. What? Brett asked, his voice cracking slightly. You want to finish this? Daniel asked, shouldering his damaged backpack with movements that seemed somehow dangerous. Then let's finish it, just you and me. Ryan laughed nervously, but the sound was forced and unconvincing. My name, Daniel said in a voice that carried clearly through the sudden quiet, is Daniel Matthews. The laughter died instantly. Something in his tone, his posture, the way he held himself made everyone pay attention. It was the voice of someone who had made a decision, who had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Brett recovered quickly, his face flushing with embarrassment at his involuntary retreat. He had to reassert dominance quickly, or risk losing face in front of his audience. I don't care what your name is, freak. You're still a... Tomorrow, Daniel interrupted, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that made several students shift uncomfortably. After school, the empty lot behind the gym. His posture was different too, more balanced, more ready. Students who had been laughing moments before felt a chill run down their spines as they watched him collect his belongings with methodical calm. "That was pretty clumsy, mouse boy," Brett continued, performing for his audience. The laughter was starting to die down, replaced by an uncomfortable tension that no one could quite explain. "Maybe you should watch where you're—" Daniel straightened and looked directly at Brett for the first time in 2 months. What Brett saw in those pale green eyes made him take an involuntary step backward. The eyes were no longer empty or defeated. They were calculating, measuring, evaluating threat levels with the precision of a trained fighter. Something snapped inside Daniel's mind, like a wire stretched too tight, finally breaking. The sound was almost audible, a mental click that changed everything. All the accumulated frustration, humiliation, and anger converged into a single point of crystalline clarity. Daniel rose with a fluid grace that caught several students off guard. His movements were suddenly different, more purposeful, controlled, dangerous. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable, like watching a sleeping predator awaken. He deliberately dusted off his jeans, each movement precise and economical. His breathing had changed, becoming deeper and more rhythmic. But what truly shattered something inside him was seeing Ashley cover her mouth, not in shock at the cruelty, but to hide her own laughter. She was supposed to be the good one, the voice of reason in Brett's group. But in this moment, she was just another face in the crowd, finding entertainment in his misery. It was students pulling out phones to record his humiliation, their screens glowing as they captured his lowest moment for posterity. The videos would be posted to social media within minutes, shared among classmates, preserved forever as evidence of his powerlessness. It was realizing that to them, he was not human. He was entertainment, a source of amusement, something to be pointed at and laughed at. The months of enduring harassment with dignity had been for nothing. His restraint had been interpreted as weakness, his philosophy as cowardice. But what hurt most was not the physical impact, it was the sound that followed. Students burst into laughter, their voices echoing off the concrete walls with cruel intensity. Brett's voice rose above the rest. "Oops, guess the mouse isn't very coordinated." The laughter was like a physical assault, each voice adding to the chorus of humiliation. Daniel lay surrounded by scattered belongings and mocking voices, feeling more isolated than he had ever felt in his life. This was what he had been trying to avoid, this moment of complete social destruction. He hit the ground hard but controlled, rolling to absorb the impact instead of fighting it. The technique was called breakfalling, something he had practiced thousands of times in the dojo. What should have been a devastating fall became a controlled tumble that minimized injury around him. His belongings scattered across the floor. His English notebook was torn and dirty, its pages fluttering in the artificial breeze created by the school's heating system. His calculator lay with its screen cracked, the digital display flickering weakly before going dark. Pens and pencils rolled across the floor, disappearing under other students' feet. What happened next unfolded in slow motion, each detail etched into Daniel's memory with perfect clarity. Brett nodded to Ryan, who was positioned behind Daniel. It was a subtle gesture, barely noticeable to the casual observer, but Daniel caught it in his peripheral vision. Ryan's foot shot out in a perfectly timed leg sweep, catching Daniel's ankle as he stepped forward. The technique was crude compared to what Daniel had learned in the dojo, but it was effective for its intended purpose. Daniel felt himself falling, his backpack flying open as he tumbled toward the concrete stairs. The stairs were unforgiving, each step a concrete edge that promised pain to anyone who hit them incorrectly. Daniel's body went into automatic mode, his jujitsu training kicking in without conscious thought. His hands shot out to break his fall, his core engaging to protect his spine, his body twisting to avoid the worst of the impact. "I need to get to class," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words came out more pleading than he intended, revealing the desperation he had been working so hard to conceal. Class. Brett pretended to consider this, tilting his head with mock thoughtfulness. "Well, maybe you should have thought about that before being such a stuck-up little weirdo." The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Daniel felt the familiar internal struggle between his trained instincts and his philosophical beliefs. His body was preparing for conflict, muscles tensing, center of gravity dropping, but his mind was still searching for a peaceful resolution. Did you guys hear that? The mouse actually spoke? Several students stopped to watch, forming a loose circle around the confrontation. They sensed blood in the water, and their teenage instincts drew them toward the spectacle. Some looked excited, others uncomfortable, but none moved to intervene. Daniel felt the weight of their stares, the pressure of being the center of unwanted attention. This was exactly what he had been trying to avoid for months, being forced into a public confrontation that would define his place in the school's social hierarchy. The word freak hit Daniel like a physical blow. It was more than an insult. It was a deliberate attempt to dehumanize him, to reduce him to something less than human. He felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, his breathing becoming deeper and more controlled, a warning sign he recognized from countless hours on the mat. "I'm fine," Daniel said quietly, his voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through his veins. The response was automatic, designed to de-escalate the situation without appearing weak or confrontational. "Excuse me?" Brett's grin widened, his eyes lighting up with cruel amusement. As Daniel approached, Brett stepped directly into his path. The movement was casual, as if he were simply adjusting his position, but the timing was perfect. "Well, well, if it isn't our favorite little mouse," Brett said loudly, his voice carrying across the hallway. Several students slowed their pace, sensing potential entertainment. Others pretended not to notice while secretly listening, their eyes fixed on their phones or books, but their attention focused on the developing confrontation. "How's your day going, Danny boy?" Brett continued, his voice dripping with false friendliness. The nickname was particularly galling because it reduced Daniel to something childish and insignificant. Daniel kept his eyes forward and tried to step around, but Ryan blocked his movement. The wrestler's presence was intimidating, his compact frame radiating barely contained violence. "Brett asked you a question, freak," Ryan growled, his voice low and threatening. They were there intentionally, having chosen a location that maximized their audience while minimizing adult supervision. Brett leaned against the wall with his characteristic smirk while Ryan and Tyler flanked the narrow passage. The stairwell was a natural bottleneck, forcing students to slow down and navigate carefully. The walls were covered with motivational posters defaced with graffiti, and the floor was perpetually wet from students tracking in rain and snow. It was the perfect place for an accident to occur. Daniel considered turning around, but he was already late for a test that would significantly impact his grade. Mrs. Henderson had been clear that makeup exams were only permitted for documented emergencies, and he could not afford to miss this assessment. "Just walk past them," he told himself, adjusting his backpack and checking his watch. He had exactly 3 minutes to reach the classroom before the test began. The breaking point arrived on a rainy Thursday in November. The weather had been miserable all week, with gray clouds and persistent drizzle making the school feel even more oppressive than usual. Students were irritable from being confined indoors, and tensions were higher than normal. Daniel was walking to English class when he saw Brett's group positioned near the main stairwell. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. If the adults wouldn't protect him, then he would have to protect himself. But protection might necessitate actions that would change everything. Actions that would reveal capabilities he had kept hidden for good reason. His bedroom reflected his dual nature. On one side, typical teenage items like homework scattered across a desk, a computer for school assignments, and clothes draped over a chair. On the other side, subtle hints of his martial arts background. A small shelf with trophy medals from competitions, a framed photo of him with Master Chen, and a wooden practice dummy most people would assume was decorative. Even Principal Williams would simply nod and keep walking when witnessing obvious harassment. He was a political creature who understood that Brett's family contributed significantly to the school's booster club, and alienating them would create problems for his own career advancement. "They're all part of the same system," Daniel realized bitterly one evening as he sat in his room staring at the ceiling. "Brett's dad owns half the businesses in town. I'm just some transfer student who doesn't matter." The teachers seemed oblivious or unwilling to intervene. Mrs. Rodriguez would look away when Brett made comments during history class, her eyes suddenly finding something fascinating about the textbook on her desk. She was a veteran teacher nearing retirement who had long ago learned to pick her battles carefully. Coach Martinez never noticed when Ryan deliberately fouled Daniel during basketball, too focused on the players he considered important to pay attention to what happened to the quiet kid who barely participated. In the coach's world, Daniel was invisible, neither athletic enough to matter nor problematic enough to require attention. The rumors spread through the school's social network with the speed only teenage gossip could achieve. Daniel would notice students whispering when he passed, their conversations abruptly stopping when they realized he was within earshot. The looks he received shifted from indifference to suspicion to outright hostility. His family situation was actually quite normal, but the truth was far less interesting than the fiction Brett's group had created. His father worked as a quality control supervisor at Patterson Manufacturing, a job requiring attention to detail and technical expertise. His mother was a part-time bookkeeper for several local businesses, working from home to maintain flexibility for family responsibilities. They created fake profiles using variations of his name and posted embarrassing content designed to damage his reputation. One particularly cruel post showed a photo of Daniel eating lunch alone in the library captioned, "When you have no friends because you're a total freak." The image had been taken from a distance, likely with a phone camera, and edited to enhance his isolation. They spread rumors that escalated in creativity and cruelty. First that he was mute and couldn't speak, then that he was on medication for mental illness, and finally that his family was involved in drugs, explaining their sudden move to Pennsylvania. However, maintaining control became harder as the weeks passed. The bullying extended beyond school grounds when Brett's group started following him home in Brett's lifted truck. They would drive slowly behind him as he walked, shouting insults from the open windows and revving the engine to startle him. "Hey, mouse boy," Ryan would yell. "Where are you going so fast?" "Maybe we should give him a ride," Tyler would add, though his voice lacked conviction. Daniel maintained his steady pace, never looking back, never acknowledging their presence. But the psychological impact was significant. The walk home, once a peaceful transition from school to personal time, became another gauntlet to endure. They created fake social media accounts to post humiliating memes. Photos of Daniel, taken without his knowledge, were edited to make him appear even smaller and more pathetic. Daniel heard every word from 3 tables away. His enhanced awareness, honed through years of sparring, picked up conversations others missed. The dojo had taught him to be constantly aware of his surroundings, to process multiple inputs simultaneously, and to recognize potential threats before they materialized. His hearing had become acute through training exercises where he practiced techniques while blindfolded, learning to rely on sound and touch rather than sight. Master Chen had explained that true martial artists developed all their senses, not just the ones most people relied on. Daniel felt his jaw clench as he processed Brett's words, then forced himself to relax. Control, he reminded himself, always control. The breathing techniques came automatically now, deep inhalation through the nose, slow exhalation through the mouth, centering his mind and body. That's the problem. He acts like he's above it all, like he's better than us. Someone needs to teach him his place. What if he's just shy, Ashley persisted. Not everyone wants to be the center of attention. It's not about attention, Brett snapped. It's about respect. You can't just walk around here acting like you don't belong to the same world as everyone else. Ashley wanted to argue further, but recognized the futility. When Brett got an idea in his head, particularly one involving asserting his dominance, he was impossible to dissuade. She had seen this pattern before, with other students who had crossed him, and it never ended well for the targets. "He doesn't even fight back," Brett complained to his girlfriend Ashley during lunch one particularly frustrating day. They were sitting at their usual table near the windows where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cafeteria floor. Ashley was picking at her salad while Brett recounted his latest encounter with Daniel. "What kind of guy just takes it?" Brett continued, his voice rising with irritation. "It's like he's not even human." Ashley frowned, pushing her salad around her plate with her fork. She was a pretty girl with shoulder-length blonde hair and blue eyes that usually sparkled with humor. But lately, she'd been growing uncomfortable with Brett's obsession with the quiet transfer student. "Maybe you should leave him alone, Brett," she suggested quietly. "He's not bothering anyone." Brett's expression darkened, his jaw tightening in a way Ashley had learned to recognize as a warning sign. His father's influence provided an additional layer of protection, making teachers reluctant to pursue complaints too aggressively. The harassment followed a careful pattern designed to maximize psychological impact while minimizing the risk of punishment. Each incident was spaced far enough apart to avoid appearing systematic, varied enough to prevent teachers from recognizing a pattern, and subtle enough to be dismissed as typical teenage behavior. The impact would send Daniel stumbling, his ears ringing from the blow. Coach Martinez would blow his whistle and yell, "Keep your head up, Matthews," as if Daniel were to blame for not avoiding the projectile. Tyler would jog past afterward, muttering what sounded like an apology but was actually another insult delivered too quietly for the coach to hear. Brett orchestrated it all with calculated cruelty, always careful to maintain plausible deniability. He had studied the school's disciplinary policies and knew exactly how far he could push without triggering serious consequences. The janitor would eventually arrive with a mop, shaking his head at the mess, treating Daniel more like a perpetrator than a victim. In gym class, Tyler would throw dodgeballs directly at Daniel's head with unnecessary force. The poorly lit gymnasium created shadows that made it difficult to track the ball's trajectory. Tyler would wait until Daniel was distracted or off balance, then fire the rubber ball with the accuracy developed through years of basketball training. The incidents rapidly escalated as Brett's frustration with Daniel's lack of reaction grew. In the cafeteria, Ryan would accidentally bump his tray, sending food flying across the floor. The collision would be perfectly timed, just as Daniel was navigating between tables with his lunch, usually a simple sandwich and apple he had brought from home. "Oops," Ryan would say, his voice just loud enough to draw attention. "Guess you should watch where you're going." Daniel would kneel on the sticky cafeteria floor, gathering the scattered remains of his lunch while other students watched. Some would laugh, others would look away uncomfortably, but none would offer to help. The vandalism was always dismissed as teenage pranks, the harassment as boys being boys. He endured Brett's group blocking his path to class, causing him to be late and face teachers' disapproval. They would form a casual semicircle in the hallway, appearing to be engaged in normal conversation while strategically obstructing his route. When Daniel tried to walk around them, they would shift position, maintaining the blockade while pretending not to notice his presence. "Excuse me," Daniel would say politely, his voice barely above a whisper. "Oh, sorry," Brett would reply with exaggerated courtesy. "Didn't see you there, little guy." But their movement would be minimal, forcing Daniel to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for his small frame. His delayed arrival to class would earn him disapproving looks from teachers who assumed he was simply disorganized or disrespectful of their time. So, Daniel endured. He endured his backpack being knocked off his shoulder as he climbed the stairs to the second floor, scattering his books down the steps and forcing him to scramble to collect them while other students walked around him. Brett would always offer a sarcastic "sorry about that" before continuing on his way, leaving Daniel to gather his scattered belongings. He endured finding his locker vandalized with cruel messages. "Freak" written in permanent marker across the metal surface, "Weirdo" scratched into the paint with a key. Once he opened his locker to find a note reading, "Why don't you just kill yourself?" in block letters, folded neatly on top of his chemistry textbook. Each incident was reported to the administration, but the responses were always the same. Mrs. Peterson, the vice principal, would nod sympathetically and promise to investigate, but nothing ever came of these inquiries. Master Chen, a second-degree black belt who had competed professionally in Brazil before immigrating to the United States, was a small man, even smaller than Daniel, yet his presence commanded any room he entered. His philosophy was simple: a real warrior doesn't fight to prove himself. He fights only when all other options are exhausted. Daniel could hear Master Chen's voice in his head during these confrontations, reminding him that the ability to harm someone carried the responsibility of restraint. Violence was a tool to be used only when absolutely necessary, not as a first resort or a solution to social problems. If only you knew, Daniel thought during one of their encounters. He was at his locker, organizing books for his next class when Brett and his friends approached. The hallway was quieter than usual, most students already in their classrooms, leaving Daniel isolated with his tormentors. His sensei had taught him that true strength lay in choosing battles wisely. "Most kids would have snapped by now or at least tried to avoid us." Brett's jaw tightened. There was something about Daniel's composure that felt like a personal insult. In Brett's world, respect was earned through dominance, and Daniel's refusal to show fear or submission challenged the natural order. So he developed an expression of complete neutrality, as if their words were merely background noise that didn't register. However, maintaining this facade demanded immense energy. Each day, Daniel would return home mentally exhausted from the effort of appearing unaffected. He would retreat to his room, put on headphones, and try to center himself through meditation techniques learned in the dojo. The stress began to manifest in subtle ways. He was sleeping poorly, his appetite diminished, and his usual enthusiasm for training waned. "What's wrong with this kid?" Brett complained to Ryan after Daniel failed to respond to being called Mouse for the 5th time that week. They were walking to lunch. their usual table awaiting them in the center of the cafeteria from where they could survey their domain. "It's like he doesn't even care," Ryan agreed, his frustration evident. Mouse, Shrimp, and Tiny were among the more inventive nicknames they devised. The comments were always delivered with smiles, as if they were friendly observations rather than deliberate attempts to dehumanize him. Daniel absorbed it all without reaction, his face a calm mask that only further frustrated Brett. He had learned from his father that bullies craved a reaction, and that showing pain or anger only encouraged escalation. He possessed a talent for cruelty that stayed just within the bounds of what teachers would consider normal teenage behavior. Whispered comments about his size became a daily occurrence. The three boys would lower their voices just enough to seem discreet, while ensuring their comments reached Daniel's ears. They discussed his appearance, his clothing, his apparent lack of friends, always with the cruel creativity teenage boys employed for character assassination. "Look at those jeans," Ryan would say, his voice dripping with disdain. "Did he get those from the Salvation Army?" "Probably," Tyler would add, though his heart never seemed fully in it. "My mom donates clothes there. I think I recognize that shirt." Brett orchestrated these moments with perfect timing, waiting until Daniel was close enough to hear, but far enough away to maintain plausible deniability if confronted. It began subtly, as these things often do. A shoulder check in the hallway during the busy transition between third and fourth periods. "Watch it, Shrimp," Brett would mutter as Daniel stumbled, his backpack swaying from the impact. The collision was always perfectly timed for when the hallway was crowded enough for cover, but not so busy that teachers would notice. Daniel would regain his balance without complaint, adjust his backpack, and continue on his way. His expression remained unchanged, his pace unwavering. To observers, it might have seemed like simple clumsiness, but Daniel recognized the deliberate nature of the contact, the angle of approach, the timing, the force, all calculated to humiliate without appearing intentional. Snickers would follow when he walked past their table in the cafeteria. He often appeared uncomfortable during their bullying sessions, but never spoke up, fearing he would become a target himself. The three had been friends since elementary school, their bond forged by shared athletic achievements and similar social standing in their small town. They moved through the school with an air of ownership, claiming cafeteria tables, parking spots, and sections of the hallway as their territory. His two closest companions were Ryan Walsh, a sturdy wrestler with hostile eyes and a perpetual scowl, and Tyler Brooks, a tall basketball player who unquestioningly followed Brett's lead. Ryan was built like a fire hydrant, with thick arms and a neck seemingly vanishing into his shoulders. His wrestling success had earned him a reputation for toughness, which he wore like armor, constantly seeking opportunities to assert his dominance. Tyler was the quiet follower, tall and lanky with nervous energy channeled into basketball. He was skilled on the court, but lacked the courage to confront Brett when their group's activities crossed ethical boundaries. Unfortunately, the first person to notice Daniel was Brett Henderson, a 6'2" senior varsity football player who controlled the school through intimidation and his father's money. Brett had perfectly styled thick dark hair, broad shoulders that stretched his leather jacket, and the arrogant smirk of someone who had never faced real consequences. His face was conventionally handsome, with a strong jaw and blue eyes that could instantly turn cold. Brett's father owned Henderson Construction, one of the town's largest employers, granting Brett a sense of invincibility. Teachers were hesitant to discipline him severely, aware of his father's substantial donations to the school's athletic programs. His family's wealth was evident in everything from his expensive truck and designer clothes to his casual spending, which most students could only dream of. Being new already made him conspicuous in a community where everyone knew everyone else's affairs. His family had relocated to Pennsylvania from California due to his father's new job at a local manufacturing plant. The transition had been challenging for Daniel, as it meant leaving behind the familiar dojo where he had trained since age 7, friends who understood his quiet nature, and teachers who appreciated his thoughtful class contributions. However, being small and quiet also made him a target. Within the high school social hierarchy, he embodied everything alpha personalities disliked: someone who avoided attention, sought not to impress, and seemed content to exist on the fringes of their world. This familiar mantra had sustained him through his initial 3 months at Lincoln. His words were nearly inaudible amidst the din of teenage voices, slamming lockers, and the distant thud of a basketball in the gymnasium. Lincoln High accommodated over 1,800 students, most of whom had grown up together in this small Pennsylvania town. The school building, a testament to 1970s architecture, featured brown brick and narrow windows that allowed minimal natural light. While the hallways were wide enough for the student body, they felt cramped and claustrophobic during passing periods. They were unaware that his composed demeanor stemmed not from weakness, but from the discipline his sensei had instilled in him since childhood. The dojo, a sacred space in his mind, was where respect, humility, and controlled aggression were equally taught. His father, Michael Matthews, his first instructor, had imparted not only techniques but also a philosophy on their appropriate use. What others failed to grasp was Daniel's deliberate silence, born from his precise understanding of his capabilities. He had witnessed the panic in opponents' eyes as they realized they couldn't escape his holds and experienced the satisfaction of technical dominance over larger, stronger training partners. Crucially, he comprehended the responsibility accompanying such knowledge. "Just get through today," Daniel silently urged himself as he headed for his locker. Unseen beneath his oversized flannel shirts and faded denim was 8 years of Brazilian jiu-jitsu training. His clothing was intentionally chosen to conceal the compact musculature developed from countless hours of grappling, drilling, and sparring. His shoulders, though narrow, were dense with functional strength, and his forearms, hidden by long sleeves, bore the calluses and rope burns from years of gripping GIs and practicing submissions. These eyes held a depth that most overlooked, preoccupied by his modest height, to notice the intellect and awareness beneath his quiet exterior. Most students at Lincoln barely registered his presence, which suited Daniel perfectly. He had mastered the art of being unnoticeable, moving through the school like a phantom, meticulously timing his movements to avoid main traffic flows and selecting routes that kept him away from popular gathering spots. His locker was located in a less desirable area of the building, distant from the central hub where athletes and popular students convened.